Hey y'all, so you guys really impressed me last week whenever we did our Nearpod on how to punctuate dialogue, but I want to go into further detail on how we would do that depending on where speech tags change and depending on how tone and inflection change. So the first thing, the bottom line, is using quotation marks. We add quotation marks around what the character is saying out loud, and the quotation marks look just like this. So if I were to place the quotation marks in the sentence that I provided that is not punctuated on purpose, where would they go? The sentence says, "There are only 33 days until Halloween," exclaimed Miss Sullivan. So I know that Miss Sullivan is saying there are only 33 days until Halloween. So I think the quotations go there and there. And notice how it goes on the outside of the first word and on the outside of the punctuation of the last word being said. So I changed my quotation marks to match the font. So they're right there and right there. There are only 33 days until Halloween, exclaimed Miss Sullivan. But something is missing from the end of the sentence. Right now, the sentence is just kind of hanging out in limbo. And the reader, whenever they read a sentence like this without proper punctuation, they don't know if there's going to be a continuation of the character speaking or of the speech tag, and it's a little bit confusing. So at the end of a sentence, or the end of the speech tag in this case, we're going to add a period. So always make sure you punctuate your dialogue correctly. So what if the speech tag is in a different spot? So let's read it again. "There are only 33 days, exclaimed Miss Sullivan, until Halloween." So sometimes an author will put a speech tag, which is exclaim Miss Sullivan. That's our speech tag. They'll put a speech tag in the middle of a sentence, and that's just to vary their writing style and to make sure the reader doesn't get too bored. Because if you read five dialogues in a row where it says this character said this and this character says that, it's pretty boring. So sometimes authors add speech tags in the middle of the sentence or the dialogue to kind of break it up a little bit. So the way that we would punctuate if this happens, we still put quotation marks around what's being said. So there are only 33 days, exclaimed Miss Sullivan, until Halloween. So those are the things that Miss Sullivan is saying out loud. So the quotation marks are good. Now, this is where things get a little bit more complicated. We already have punctuation at the end of the sentence, but there needs to be punctuation to separate the speech tag from the dialogue. We've already separated the dialogue from the speech tag, but now we need to separate the speech tag from the dialogue. And the way that we do that whenever we're writing is to add a comma. Notice how the comma is before the quotation marks and after the speech tag in the middle. So reading it again, it says, "There are only 33 days, exclaimed Miss Sullivan, until Halloween." So make sure that you are adding commas to separate the speech tag from the dialogue, and you are always adding quotation marks around what's being said out loud. Again, the speech tag is in a different spot. The first example was at the very end of our dialogue. The second example, it was in the middle. And now our speech tag, which is right here, Miss Sullivan exclaimed, our speech tag is at the very beginning. So how are we going to punctuate that? Well, we know that we're always going to put quotation marks around what's being said out loud. So there are only 33 days until Halloween. I know that's what she's saying out loud, so I'm putting quotation marks around what's being said, and I'm paying special attention to make sure that the quotations also include the punctuation mark at the end. And like we did in the second example, we set off the speech tag with a comma so that the reader knows that something is about to be said. So Miss Sullivan exclaimed, comma, "There are only 33 days until Halloween," with quotation marks at the end. So setting off the speech tag, you're almost always going to use a comma. Sometimes whenever writers are writing for different characters or for different moods, the tone changes in the character's dialogue. So the difference between our first example and this example is that this one is a little less excited. So Miss Sullivan said instead of Miss Sullivan exclaimed. So Miss Sullivan said, "There are only 33 days until Halloween." So we know that our 4 punctuation marks We could have, or I guess our 3 punctuation marks, sorry, our end marks would be a period, an exclamation point, and a question mark. So if we're just saying something, we're not really asking a question. She's not asking somebody if there's 33 days until Halloween, so it's not a question mark. We're not as excited, so we're not putting an exclamation mark. So whenever you see that word said, it's pretty flat, and it's just delivering you a message, and it's not really saying it in any certain way. So it would be a period. So Miss Sullivan said there are only 33 days until Halloween. That means I'm going to put a period at the end. I'm also going to put quotation marks around what's being said, and I'm paying special attention that my period is inside the quotation marks. And to set off my speech tag at the beginning, I separate it with a comma. So it says, Miss Sullivan said there are only 33 days until Halloween. So this is something that happens sometimes whenever there is a period at the end of a dialogue. So I'm using the same example as the slide before, where it's not as much excitement, so it's going to be a period. But my speech tag is at the end, which means that I have to separate my speech tag with a comma. And so this is where a weird dialogue rule comes into play. Before I tell you what it is, I'm going to go ahead and add my quotation marks around what's being said. So there are only 33 days until Halloween. And said Miss Sullivan. So that's going to end in a period. But I'm missing one more thing. And this is where things get a little bit more funky. So there are only 33 days until Halloween, said Miss Sullivan. So, remember how I said how you have to separate the dialogue with quotation marks and the speech tag with a comma? Instead of ending this dialogue with a period, which is what some people want to naturally do, we actually are going to use a comma because it's coming, the speech tag is coming at the end of the sentence. This rule only applies for the use of a period, though. If I changed my speech tag to say exclaimed, like it did in the beginning, I wouldn't add a comma. It would just say an exclamation point, and the speech tag would end in a period. So we're going to practice that a little bit more. But those are some of the dialogue rules that you're going to be quizzed on at the end of the week, and what you're going to be using whenever you write a story of your own.